Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little dramatic, but don't worry, we're going to keep it soft, slow, and just mildly judgmental. So go ahead, dim the lights a bit, maybe lie down, adjust your pillow like you're about to listen to a very long story that somehow involves both divine beauty contests and a guy who really should have known better. Because tonight, we're drifting into the truth behind the Trojan War. And yes, it's one of those stories where everything could have been avoided if literally one person had made a slightly less terrible decision. But of course he didn't, because history would be boring otherwise. So let's ease into it. Imagine a wedding. Not just any wedding, a divine one. Gods, goddesses, fancy foods, probably way too much wine. Everyone dressed like they're trying to outshine the sun. And then there's one small detail. Someone forgot to invite Eris, the goddess of chaos and discord, which already feels like a bold strategy. Not inviting the literal embodiment of drama to your event. It's like hosting a family dinner and not inviting the one relative who thrives on starting arguments and thinking that'll just go smoothly. Of course it didn't. Eris shows up anyway because of course she does, and she brings a little gift. A golden apple. Simple. Elegant. Slightly ominous. And on it, she writes, "To the fairest." Now, if you've ever met more than two people, you already know where this is going. Three goddesses immediately decide the apple is obviously meant for them. Hera, Queen of the gods, very into status and power. Athena, goddess of wisdom, also not exactly known for backing down. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, who, let's be honest, probably assumed she had this one in the bag. And instead of, talking it out like emotionally mature immortals, they decide to get a human involved. Because why not complicate things further? Enter Paris, a prince of Troy. Also a man whose entire legacy is basically that one guy who made the worst possible choice. Now, Paris is given the task of judging which goddess is the fairest. No pressure. Just three powerful deities staring at you, each fully capable of ruining your life, or ending it, or worse, making it deeply awkward forever. So naturally they start bribing him. Hera offers power. Rule over vast lands. Basically, ultimate political authority. Athena offers wisdom and victory in battle. A sharp mind. Respect. Success. And Aphrodite. She offers the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, in a moment that historians might gently describe as predictable, chooses Aphrodite. Because, of course he does. Power? Wisdom? Long-term stability? No. He picks romance. Or more accurately, the idea of romance wrapped in divine marketing. And this is where things get inconvenient. Because the most beautiful woman in the world already has a husband. Her name is Helen, and she's married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Which means Paris has just agreed to steal another man's wife, because a goddess told him that it would be a good idea. Which, to be fair, is not the worst advice gods have ever given in mythology, but it's definitely up there. So Paris travels to Sparta. And here's where the story gets a little fuzzy, depending on who you ask. Some versions say Helen falls in love with him. Others suggest she didn't exactly have much of a choice. Either way, the outcome is the same. Paris leaves Sparta with Helen. And a fair amount of stolen treasure because apparently we're committing multiple offenses now. Just really going all in. And Menelaus? Well, he's not thrilled, which is understandable. You go out, maybe handle some business, come back home, And your wife has gone along with a prince who probably smiled too much and asked suspiciously charming questions at dinner. It's not ideal. So Menelaus does what any wronged king would do. He calls his brother, Agamemnon. Now, Agamemnon is, how do we put this gently, not exactly a calming presence. He's ambitious, powerful, and very ready for a large-scale conflict, which works out because this situation is about to escalate dramatically. You see, Helen wasn't just anyone. Before she married Menelaus, there were many suitors. And to avoid chaos, they all swore an oath. A promise that if anyone ever tried to take Helen, they would all come together to defend her marriage, which, at the time, probably felt like a nice symbolic gesture. You know, a little, we're all friends here moment.
But now?
Now it's turning into a full-blown military obligation. So Agamemnon calls in the oath. And suddenly, all across Greece, kings and warriors are being summoned, including some very famous names. Odysseus, who really doesn't want to go and tries to fake madness, which is honestly relatable. Achilles, the ultimate warrior, with a personality that could be described as intense. Ajax, strong, reliable, not big on subtlety. And a whole collection of others, all preparing for a war that started because one guy picked the wrong goddess in a beauty contest. Just let that sink in. Years of fighting, thousands of lives, all because Paris thought, yeah, I'll take the pretty one. And now we slowly drift toward Troy, a city that, at this moment, is probably just going about its day. Markets open, people chatting. Maybe someone's complaining about the weather, completely unaware that an entire coalition of angry Greeks is on its way. All because their prince made a slightly questionable romantic decision. Let's pause here for a moment, because already the Trojan War is less about heroic destiny and more about a series of deeply human choices.
Pride,
Desire,
ego,
and just a tiny bit of divine meddling for flavor. And as we move forward, things don't exactly become more sensible. In fact, they get slower, messier, and a little more awkward, which is perfect for us, because we're not here for excitement. We're here to gently observe as history, or myth, quietly unravels itself. So settle in, because next we'll float over to the Greek camp, where egos are already clashing, plans are already falling apart, and the war hasn't even properly started yet. All right, let's just gently drift back in. If you adjusted your blanket or stared at the ceiling for a bit, perfect. That's exactly the energy we want, because now the Greeks have gathered, or at least they're trying to. And leading this entire operation, we have Agamemnon, which is the choice. Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae, brother of Menelaus, and technically the guy in charge of this whole let's sail across the sea and start a decade-long war situation. He's powerful. He's respected. He's also not exactly easy to like. Think of him as that manager who got promoted because he's confident, not because he's particularly good at managing people. And now he's in charge of an army filled with extremely strong personalities, which already feels like a slow-moving disaster. So the Greek forces gather at a place called Aulis. Ships lined up, soldiers waiting, everyone trying to look heroic, while probably wondering how long this is actually going to take. And then, nothing happens. No wind. The ships just sit there, sails hanging completely still, which is not ideal when your entire plan depends on crossing the sea. Now, at this point, someone might suggest patience, or maybe reconsidering the whole war.
But no.
Instead, they consult a prophet, because of course they do. And the prophet delivers some less than comforting news. The goddess Artemis is angry.
Why?
Well, depending on the version, Agamemnon may have offended her. Maybe he bragged about his hunting skills. Maybe he killed a sacred animal. Maybe it was just one of those divine mood swings.
Hard to say.
But the solution? Oh, it's not great. Artemis will only allow the winds to return if Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter, Iphigenia.
Now,
there are many ways to respond to this kind of request. You could say no. You could question the entire system that led to this moment. You could simply go home. But Agamemnon, he hesitates. And then, because this is a story about people making very questionable decisions, he agrees. Sort of. He doesn't exactly announce it. Instead, he invites Iphigenia to Aulis, under the pretense that she's going to be married to Achilles, which is the very creative interpretation of family gathering. So she arrives, expecting a wedding. Probably a little nervous, maybe a little excited. And instead, she walks into this. An army, a ritual, and a father who is suddenly very interested in not making eye contact. Some versions of the story try to soften this. They say Artemis replaces Iphigenia with a deer at the last moment. Others are less generous. Either way, the situation is deeply uncomfortable. And the Greek army? They're just standing there waiting for the wind. Because apparently this is now normal. Eventually, the winds return. The ships can finally sail. And just like that, the war officially begins, with a sacrifice that sets the tone for everything that follows, which is to say, not exactly a happy start. So the Greeks set off, hundreds of ships cutting across the sea, heading toward Troy. And after some time, they arrive. And what they find is a city that is very well defended. High walls, strong gates, prepared defenders. In other words, this is not going to be quick. Now, here's where things slow down. Because the Trojan War, despite its reputation, is not a constant stream of action. It's long, very long. Years pass, and a lot of that time is spent waiting, raiding nearby areas, arguing, trying to maintain morale. It's less like a single dramatic battle and more like a very extended, very tense stalemate, which, honestly, feels more realistic. War is often just time passing with occasional bursts of chaos. Inside Troy, life continues. To an extent. King Priam rules the city. He's older, experienced, trying to manage a situation that is steadily becoming more complicated. His son Hector is the real backbone of the defense.
Calm.
Responsible. Actually competent. Which makes him stand out quite a bit. Because Paris is still here. Still the same guy who started all of this. Still not particularly known for bravery. He's more comfortable staying back, letting others handle the consequences of his decisions, which is a consistent character trait.
You have to give him that.
Helen is also in Troy, and her situation is complicated. In some versions, she regrets everything. In others, she adapts. Either way, she's now at the center of a war that has very little to do with her actual choices, which feels unfair, but also very on brand for this story. Back at the Greek camp, things are tense. Because remember, this is not a unified army. It's a collection of kings, each with their own pride, their own expectations, their own ideas about how things should go. And leading them all is Agamemnon, who, again, is not exactly a master of diplomacy. And eventually this tension turns into something very specific, a conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. Now Achilles, he's the best warrior the Greeks have.
Fast. Strong.
Almost unstoppable. Also deeply sensitive to insults, which in this environment is not ideal. So when Agamemnon decides to assert his authority in a way that directly affects Achilles, things don't go well. There's an argument, voices raised, egos clashing, and Achilles decides he's done. He withdraws from the fighting. Just like that, the Greeks lose their strongest warrior, not because of the enemy, but because of internal drama, which honestly feels very human. So now the war continues, but without Achilles. And suddenly the balance starts to shift. The Trojans, led by Hector, begin to push back, stronger, more confident, and the Greeks start to struggle, all because two men couldn't manage a disagreement. Let's just sit with that for a second. An entire war influenced by a personal argument. It's almost impressively inefficient. And as we move forward, things will continue to unfold slowly, steadily, with moments of tension followed by long stretches of waiting. Because this isn't a story of constant action. It's a story of people.
Flawed. Proud.
Tired. Making decisions that ripple outward in ways they probably didn't fully understand. So just relax, because next we'll gently drift into the story of Achilles, who is about to become even more complicated and slightly more dramatic, but in a very calm, bedtime-friendly way. All right, welcome back. If you're still here, still comfortably sinking into your pillow, perfect, because now we get to spend some time with Achilles. And Achilles is a very interesting mix of unstoppable warrior and emotionally delicate human being, which is not a combination you'd necessarily expect. But here we are. So Achilles is objectively the best fighter on the Greek side.
Fast. Strong.
Almost impossible to defeat. People talk about him like he's less of a man and more of a walking natural disaster. The kind you really hope stays on your side. But emotionally, he's let's say, highly responsive, very aware of his own importance, and extremely sensitive to anything that even vaguely feels like disrespect, which, again, in a war full of proud kings, is going to come up a lot. Now, let's gently revisit the argument with Agamemnon, because this is where things really start to unravel. Agamemnon decides, for reasons that feel a little unnecessary, to take something that belongs to Achilles, a woman named Briseis. Now, in modern terms, this situation is already uncomfortable, But within the context of the time, this is about honor, status, recognition. Achilles feels insulted, publicly. And for him, that's not something you just shrug off. So he doesn't yell for long. He doesn't fight Agamemnon. He just stops. He withdraws from the war,
Sits down.
and essentially says, "You handle it," which is a bold move when you're the main reason your side is winning. And suddenly everything slows down even more. The Greeks without Achilles are weaker. Not completely helpless, but noticeably less effective. And the Trojans? They start gaining confidence. Because for the first time, it feels like they might actually win this. Now, let's float over to Hector for a bit. Because Hector is almost the opposite of Achilles. He's not fighting for glory. He's not trying to prove anything. He's just doing his job. Protecting his city, his family. Trying to hold everything together while the situation quietly spirals. He's married. He has a child. And there's something about that makes his story feel a little heavier, a little more grounded. While Achilles is off, sitting in his tent, reflecting on his feelings, Hector is out there every day dealing with the consequences, which feels unfair, but also very typical. And back in the Greek camp, things are getting uncomfortable because they need Achilles. But Achilles does not need them. At least not right now. He's content to let things play out, to prove a point, which, to be fair, he is doing very effectively. So the Greeks try to fix things. They send a delegation.
Visit.
Ajax to few others. They go to Achilles with gifts, apologies, carefully chosen words, trying to convince him to come back. And Achilles listens, calmly, quietly, and then he says no, still offended, still not ready to let it go, which again is very human. Just slightly inconvenient for everyone else. And while all of this is happening, the Trojans keep pushing, closer to the Greek ships, closer to ending this whole thing. And the Greeks are running out of options. Now here's where things shift. Slowly,
Gently.
but noticeably. Because there's one person who can reach Achilles. One person who understands him in a way the others don't. Patroclus. Patroclus is his closest companion.
Friend.
Maybe more, depending on how you interpret it, but definitely someone who matters. A lot. And Patroclus sees what's happening. He sees the Greeks struggling. He sees the war slipping away. And he goes to Achilles not with anger, not with pride, but with concern. He asks Achilles for something simple. If you won't fight, let me. Let me wear your armor. Let me go out there and give them hope. Because sometimes it's not just about winning. It's about believing you still can. And Achilles, after everything, agrees, which feels like progress. Small but meaningful. So Patroclus puts on the armor, steps onto the battlefield, and for a moment, everything changes. The Trojans see him, and they think it's Achilles. And suddenly they hesitate. They pull back. The energy shifts. Hope returns to the Greek side. And for a little while, it works. But Patroclus is not Achilles. And eventually he goes a little too far, pushes a little too hard, and he meets Hector. Now, we're not going to rush this, because this moment is quiet, in its own way. Two men meeting in the middle of a long, exhausting war, both doing what they believe is right, both a little tired. And Hector wins. Patroclus falls. And just like that, everything changes again. Let's pause here, because this is one of those moments where the story shifts emotionally, not with noise, not with chaos, but with consequence, because Achilles is about to find out, and when he does, he's not going to stay calm, not this time. So just take a breath, settle a little deeper, because next we'll gently move into that moment where grief replaces pride, and Achilles finally stands up again, not for honor, not for glory, but for something much quieter and much heavier. All right, let's just ease back in. If your eyes are getting a little heavy, that's perfect. This story actually works better when it's a bit hazy around the edges, because now we arrive at one of those moments where everything quietly shifts. No big dramatic music, no sudden chaos, just a piece of news moving slowly across a battlefield. Patroclus is gone, and the message eventually reaches Achilles. Now, up to this point, Achilles has been many things.
Proud.
Stubborn. Slightly dramatic in a very controlled, I'm going to sit here and prove a point kind of way. But this lands differently. He doesn't argue. He doesn't calculate. He doesn't pause to consider the long-term consequences. He just breaks. Quietly at first, and then not so quietly. Because grief, especially the kind that comes with guilt, doesn't stay contained for long. And Achilles knows on some level that this is connected to him. If he had gone back to the fight earlier, if he hadn't been so focused on his own pride, if, it's the kind of thinking that doesn't lead anywhere helpful but still shows up anyway. So now, Achilles is done waiting, done proving points, done being still. He's going back to the battlefield. And this time it's not about honor. It's not about Agamemnon. It's not even really about the war anymore. It's about Patroclus. And that makes him different. Before he leaves, though, there's a small detail. His armor, the one Patroclus wore, is gone, taken by Hector, which, from a practical standpoint, is just how things work in war. But emotionally, it adds another layer. So Achilles needs new armor. And because this is still very much a myth, the solution is divine craftsmanship. The god Hephaestus steps in, creates a new set of armor. Beautiful, detailed, almost too intricate for something meant for battle. A shield that, depending on how you look at it, shows entire scenes of life. Cities, people, moments of peace. Which is a very gentle contrast to what Achilles is about to do with it. So now he's ready. And when Achilles returns to the battlefield, people notice immediately, because this isn't the same quiet withdrawal we saw earlier. This is movement, purpose, something heavy but very focused. The Trojans feel it. The Greeks feel it. Even the air around the story feels a little different, because Achilles is no longer fighting for recognition. He's not trying to be seen. He already knows who he is. Now he's just moving forward. And as he moves, the balance shifts again.
Quickly this time.
Decisively. The Trojans who had been pushing forward begin to pull back. Hector, still steady, still responsible, realizes what's happening. And unlike Paris, who tends to avoid direct confrontation, Hector steps up, because that's who he is. Now, before we get to that moment, let's slow it down just a bit, because this isn't just about two warriors meeting. It's about everything that's led them here. Hector defending his city, his family, his home. Achilles carrying grief, anger, and something quieter underneath it all. And neither of them is really here by choice anymore. They're just continuing something that started long before this moment. So they meet outside the walls of Troy. And for a second, there's hesitation. Not much, but enough to notice. Hector considers his options, which, at this point, are limited. He could retreat. He could try to negotiate. He could delay the inevitable. And for a brief moment he does run, which feels human, because sometimes even the bravest person just needs a second. But eventually he stops, turns, faces Achilles. And the fight itself? We're not going to rush through it. Because in this version of the story, it's not about flashy action. It's about the outcome, which we already feel coming. Achilles wins. Hector falls. And with him, something in the story shifts again. Quietly, heavily. Because Hector wasn't just a warrior. He was a stabilizing force. A person who made things feel held together. And now that's gone. But what happens next is where things get a little uncomfortable. Because Achilles, still caught in his grief, doesn't stop. He takes Hector's body, and instead of returning it, or allowing the usual rituals, he drags it around the city, again and again. Now, let's be honest. This isn't about strategy. It's not about war. It's about emotion. Unprocessed, unresolved, and very, very human in a way that isn't exactly admirable, but is understandable, in a quiet, uneasy kind of way. Inside Troy, King Priam hears about this. And imagine that for a moment. An older man, a king, yes, but also a father, learning that his son, the one who held everything together, is gone. And not only gone, but being treated this way. So Priam does something incredibly simple and incredibly difficult. He goes to Achilles. Personally. No army. No threats. Just a father asking for his son back. And when he stands before Achilles, he doesn't argue. He doesn't accuse. He just speaks, gently, about loss, about what it means to outlive your child. And for the first time in a while, Achilles stops. Really stops. The anger softens. The grief shifts. And for a moment, the war fades into the background. It's just two people, both carrying something heavy, both a little tired. And Achilles agrees. He returns Hector's body, allows the funeral rites, allows to pause, which is where we'll gently rest for now, because this moment, quiet as it is, matters. It reminds us that even in the middle of something as large and messy as the Trojan War, there are still small, human exchanges. Moments where everything slows down and people remember what they've lost. So just settle in, because next we'll drift toward the final stretch, where the war, which has taken years, finally begins to wind down.
Slowly, strangely,
And with one last very famous idea. That probably sounded better in theory. Alright, let's just ease back in one more time. If you've made it this far, you're basically a veteran of this very slow, very emotionally complicated war. And now we're approaching the end. Not with a sudden explosion of action, but with something much quieter, much stranger, and in a very calm way a little bit ridiculous. So after Hector's funeral, the war doesn't immediately stop. Of course it doesn't. That would be far too efficient. Instead, it continues.
slowly,
Wearily, both sides a little exhausted, a little less certain about why they're still doing this. Achilles is still there, still fighting, still carrying everything that's happened. But even he doesn't stay forever. At some point he dies. And yes, it involves an arrow. And yes, it's often described as hitting his heel, which is a very specific vulnerability for someone otherwise nearly invincible. It's almost like the universe needed a technical workaround, because nothing else was working. And with Achilles gone, the Greeks lose their most powerful fighter again. But this time, there's no dramatic return waiting. This is final. And the war, which has already stretched on for years, starts to feel stuck. Completely stuck. So naturally, someone comes up with a plan. And that someone is Odysseus. Now, Odysseus is not the strongest. He's not the fastest. But he is very good at thinking sideways. The kind of person who looks at a locked door and immediately starts checking for windows, hidden tunnels, or ways to convince someone else to open it. Which is exactly what the Greeks need right now. Because the walls of Troy, still standing, still very much in the way. So Odysseus proposes something creative. A large wooden horse, hollow inside, big enough to hide soldiers. And the idea is simple. The Greeks will pretend to leave, abandon the battlefield, sail away, or at least look like they did. And they'll leave the horse behind as a kind of offering, a symbol of surrender, or maybe a peace gesture, something that says, "We're done here," which after years of fighting probably sounds pretty convincing. And inside the horse, a small group of warriors, quiet, patient, waiting. Now, on the Greek side, this plan feels clever. A little desperate, but clever. On the Trojan side,
well,
let's just say the opinions are mixed. When the Trojans see the empty camps, the absence of ships, and this large wooden horse, they're confused, which is a perfectly reasonable reaction. Some people are suspicious, very suspicious. One man in particular, Laocoona, looks at the horse and basically says, "I don't trust this at all," which feels like the correct response. He even suggests destroying it, burning it, just not bringing it inside the city. And honestly, if they had listened to him, this story would end very differently, much earlier, much more quietly. But they don't, because of course they don't. There are signs, warnings, moments where someone could have said, Maybe let's not roll the mysterious giant wooden object into our city. But those moments pass,
slowly,
almost gently. And eventually the decision is made. The horse is brought inside the walls of Troy, set up like a trophy, a symbol of victory, which is a very optimistic interpretation. And then night falls. The city relaxes. People celebrate. The war finally over. Or so it seems. And inside the horse, the soldiers wait. Quiet. Still. Probably very uncomfortable if we're being honest. It's not exactly a spacious design. At some point, when everything is calm, they emerge, open the gates, signal the rest of the Greek army, which, surprise, did not actually leave. They were just waiting nearby, because the plan required patience and a certain level of commitment to the bit. And just like that, Troy falls, not with a dramatic final battle, not with a heroic last stand, but with a quiet, carefully timed shift. A door opening, a city unprepared. Now, we're not going to linger on the aftermath, because it's not calm, it's not soft, and it doesn't match the tone we've been gently floating through. So instead, we'll just acknowledge it. Troy, as it was, comes to an end. And Helen? She eventually returns to Sparta, back to Menelaus, which is an interesting conclusion. After everything, after all the years, everything sort of circles back. Not neatly, not perfectly, but in a way that feels almost quiet. And when you step back from the whole story, from the gods, the battles, the long years of waiting, it's hard not to notice something. This war, this massive, legendary conflict, started with a choice. A small one, a personal one person choosing beauty over everything else, and then holding on to that choice no matter the cost. And along the way, people argued. They grieved. They made decisions they probably didn't fully think through. They held on to pride when it would have been easier to let go. Which makes the whole thing feel less like a distant myth and more like something quietly familiar, just on a much larger scale. So as we let this story settle, you can almost imagine the silence after, the empty spaces where something once stood, the slow return to normal, whatever that looks like. And maybe, just maybe, a quiet thought drifting through it all, that sometimes the biggest stories come from the smallest, most human beginnings.
All right.
That's enough for tonight. Let your mind wander a bit. Let the story fade. And just rest. All right, if you're still here, just gently settle back in. This part is quieter. The war is technically over, which should feel satisfying.
Neat.
Wrapped up. Everyone goes home, lessons learned, maybe a bit of personal growth. But, of course, that's not how this works. Not here. Not with these people. Because after Troy falls, the story doesn't end. It just drifts into something slower, a little more tired, a little more awkward, like the feeling after a very long argument where no one's quite sure what to say next. The Greeks eventually leave.
Or try to.
And this is where things start to get inconvenient again. Because the gods, remember them? They're still around, still watching, still holding on to their own opinions about how everything played out, and some of them are not impressed. Take Agamemnon, our favorite slightly overconfident commander. He returns home to Mycenae, probably expecting a warm welcome, a little appreciation, maybe a thank you for your service kind of moment. Instead, he walks into a situation that has been quietly building in his absence. His wife, Clytemnestra, has had years to think, years to reflect on what happened at Aulis. On the whole, sacrificing their daughter's situation, which, as it turns out, she did not forget or forgive. So when Agamemnon comes back, it doesn't take long. Things resolve themselves in a very final, very personal way. And just like that, the man who led the entire war
Is gone.
not on the battlefield, not in glory, just at home, because sometimes the consequences take their time. Let's gently float over to Menelaus. He gets Helen back, which was the original goal, the entire reason this all started. And now here they are, back in Sparta, together again. And it's complicated, because how do you just continue? After everything? After 10 years of war? After everything that happened in between? Some versions say they reconcile, that things settle, become manageable. Others suggest it's a bit more distant,
A bit more polite.
like two people who share a history but maybe not the same feelings anymore. Either way, it's not exactly a fairy tale ending. It's quieter than that, more realistic. Now, Odysseus. Ah, yes. The man with the horse idea. You'd think, after contributing to the final victory, he'd get a smooth journey home. A nice, uneventful return. Maybe some rest.
Some peace. No.
Not even close. His trip home turns into an entire separate story. Years of wandering, getting lost, running into strange places, strange people, very strange situations. It's almost like the universe looked at him and said, "You had one good idea. Let's make sure you really think about it." But we're not going to follow him too far down that road tonight. That's a whole different bedtime story. Possibly several. And all of them slightly chaotic. Instead, let's just sit for a moment with the overall feeling. Because when you look at everything together, the beginning, the middle, and now this slow ending, there's something oddly consistent about it. No one really wins. Not in the way they expected. Not in the way they probably imagined at the start. The Greeks win the war, but lose people, lose time, lose whatever version of themselves existed before all of this. The Trojans lose their city, their home, their sense of safety, everything that once felt permanent. And the people at the center of it all, Paris, Helen, Achilles, Hector, they don't get clean endings. They just stop at different points, in different ways, which feels very human. Even in a story filled with gods and heroes, it's still about people making choices and then living with what follows. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind the Trojan War. Not the battles, not the legends, not even the horse, but the way everything unfolds slowly, because of pride, because of desire, because of moments that seemed small at the time. So, as we let this all fade, you can imagine the world continuing, new stories beginning, people rebuilding, forgetting, remembering, repeating. And somewhere in the background, a quiet reminder that even the biggest conflicts often start with something simple,
A choice.
a feeling, a moment that didn't seem like much until it was.
All right.
That really is the end. Let your thoughts drift, let the story settle, and just rest. Hey, still here?
Good.
Just get comfortable again. Maybe shift a little, let your shoulders drop. Because now we're not adding new battles. No more arguments. No more dramatic decisions that spiral into decade-long consequences. Now we just sit with what's left. Because the Trojan War in a strange way doesn't really end. It just changes shape. After everything we've gently walked through, the war stops being something people live through and becomes something people talk about, which, if you think about it, is its own kind of transformation. A slow drift from reality into memory, and then from memory into myth. Stories get told, retold, adjusted, smoothed out in places, exaggerated in others. Because people don't just pass things down. They reshape them, quietly, over time. And somewhere along the way, this long, messy, very human conflict turns into something a bit more polished, more heroic, more meaningful, or at least easier to tell at dinner without making everyone uncomfortable. Names start to stand out. Achilles becomes larger than life, almost untouchable, less of a complicated person, more of a symbol.
Strength. Glory.
Tragedy, all wrapped together nice and neat, which is interesting because we remember the legend more than the version of him who sat in a tent, refusing to participate. Hector becomes the perfect defender, the ideal son, the man who did everything right. And while that's mostly fair, it quietly smooths over the fact that he also hesitated, also ran just for a moment, because even the best people do that sometimes. Paris? Well, he doesn't get the same gentle treatment. History is not kind to him. He becomes the example of bad decisions. The guy who chose beauty and accidentally started a war, which, to be fair, is a pretty strong legacy. Not a great one, but definitely memorable. And Helen, she becomes something else entirely. A symbol, beauty itself. Something people talk about rather than someone who had to live through all of this, which feels a little unfair, but also very typical. And then there are the gods, always hovering in the background. In some versions, they're deeply involved, pulling strings, influencing decisions, turning small moments into larger ones. In others, they fade away a bit, become more like explanations, ways to make sense of things that didn't quite make sense. Because sometimes saying, a god caused this, feels easier than saying, people made complicated choices. And that brings us to something quietly interesting. Because when you strip everything back, take away the divine drama, the golden apple, the dramatic entrances, what you're left with is something surprisingly simple. A conflict between places, between people, between groups who didn't fully understand each other or didn't want to. Some historians, in a very calm, very practical way, suggest that the Trojan War might have been based on real tensions, trade routes, power struggles, cities competing for influence. Nothing quite as poetic as the face that launched 1,000 ships. More like the port that controlled a very useful shipping lane, which is less romantic, but also a bit more believable. And Troy itself?
It was a real place.
Layers of a city, built, destroyed, rebuilt again, over and over, which is quietly fascinating, because it means that somewhere underneath all the stories, there were real people living their lives, having ordinary days, probably unaware that one day their home would become the setting for one of the most famous stories ever told. And maybe that's the softest way to understand all of this, not as one single, perfect narrative, but as something layered, messy, a little inconsistent, just like memory. So when people talk about the Trojan War, they're not just talking about what happened. They're talking about what people believed happened, what they needed the story to mean. A lesson about pride, about desire, about consequences, about how small choices can quietly grow into something much larger. And as time moves on, the story keeps shifting. Different cultures, different writers, different moods. Each one adding something, taking something away, until the original shape is almost impossible to see clearly. But maybe that's okay, because not every story needs to stay perfectly intact. Some of them are meant to drift,
To change.
to reflect the people telling them. So now, as we let everything settle one last time, you can imagine the ruins of Troy, quiet,
Still.
layered with time. You can imagine the sea where the ships once gathered, now just water, moving slowly, unbothered. And somewhere in all of that, the echo of a story, not loud, not dramatic,
Just there.
a reminder that even the biggest legends often begin with something small,
A choice.
a feeling, a moment that didn't seem important until it was.
All right.
Now we really are done. Let everything fade out gently and just rest. Hey, if you're still here, you've officially outlasted the Trojan War itself, which, honestly, deserves some kind of soft, imaginary medal. So just settle in one last time. No new drama. No surprise plot twists. Just a slow, quiet drift toward the end of everything we've been gently circling. Because at a certain point, stories don't end. They just stop being told as often. They soften, fade a little at the edges, like a memory you don't revisit as much, but still recognize when it comes up. The Trojan War is one of those stories. It started with noise, gods arguing,
Kings shouting.
ships gathering, everyone very sure of themselves. And now, it's just a story people tell, softly, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with a bit of quiet skepticism. Because if you really think about it,
It's all a bit much.
a war that lasted years because of a beauty contest, a prince who made one decision, and then spent the rest of the story avoiding eye contact with the consequences. Kings who gathered entire armies because of an oath they probably didn't expect to actually matter. It's almost comforting in a strange way, because it reminds you that people, even powerful, important, supposedly wise people, have always been a little messy, a little impulsive, a little too confident in their own decisions. And yet, from that mess, we get something lasting, a story that travels across time, changes shape,
Adapts.
survives.
People write about it, talk about it,
Reimagine it, turn it into poems,
plays, books.
all trying to capture something that was never entirely clear to begin with. And maybe that's why it stays interesting. Not because it's perfectly told, but because it isn't. Because there are gaps, contradictions, moments that don't quite line up. Like Helen. Was she willing? Was she taken? Did she regret it? Did she adapt? The story never fully decides. It just lets her exist in that uncertainty. Or Achilles. Was he a hero? A symbol of glory? Or just a very talented person who didn't handle conflict particularly well? Again, the story doesn't settle. It just moves on. Even the ending, the famous horse, feels less like a grand, flawless plan, and more like something that worked because people were tired, because they wanted it to be over, because after years of conflict, you start accepting things you might have questioned before, which is very human, very quiet, very real. And when you zoom out even further, you start to see something else, something softer. That stories like this,
They're not really about the past.
not entirely. They're about the people telling them. The way each generation looks at the same events and sees something slightly different. Sometimes it's about heroism. Sometimes it's about tragedy. Sometimes it's about the consequences of pride, or love, or just one slightly impulsive decision that kept going. And sometimes it's just about the feeling of it all, the rise,
The fall.
the long, slow middle where nothing quite resolves. So now, as everything gently comes to a stop, you don't really need to hold on to every detail, every name, every moment. You can just keep the shape of it, a beginning that felt small, a middle that stretched longer than expected, an ending that wasn't as neat as anyone hoped. And somewhere in there, a quiet understanding that even the biggest stories, even the ones filled with gods and heroes, are still at their core
About people.
people who didn't always know what they were doing, people who made choices and then kept going, people who held on to things a little longer than they should have. And maybe that's why the story lingers, not because it's perfect, but because it feels familiar.
All right.
Now we really let it go. Let the edges blur. Let the voices fade. Let the whole thing drift off into that soft space where stories rest. And you just rest too. Hey, you're still here. That's honestly impressive. At this point, we've gone well past the war, past the endings, past the stories about the story. So now this is less about history and more about that quiet afterthought your brain has right before sleep. The one that shows up and goes, that was kind of a lot. So, let's just sit with it. Not analyze too hard. Not pull out big conclusions. Just gently notice a few things. Because when you strip away the gods, the armor, the dramatic speeches nobody actually needed, the Trojan War starts to feel surprisingly familiar. Not in a literal sense, obviously. You probably haven't launched a fleet over a relationship issue. Hopefully. But the pattern? That part feels a bit closer. One small decision. One moment that felt reasonable at the time. And then it grows. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Until it's something much bigger than it ever needed to be. Paris choosing Aphrodite. At the time, it probably felt simple, straightforward, even a little exciting. Like, yeah, I'll take the most beautiful person in the world. That seems like a good deal. No spreadsheets. No long-term projections. Just vibes. And then everything else. All the consequences just kind of unfolded, one after another. Menelaus reacting, Agamemnon escalating, the oath kicking in like a very inconvenient group chat obligation. Everyone showing up because they said they would, even though maybe deep down they didn't really want to. And that's the thing. A lot of this story isn't about big, dramatic evil decisions. It's about people following through. On promises. On pride. On things they said earlier when the situation felt very different. Achilles refusing to fight. Not because he wanted the war to continue, but because he felt disrespected. And that feeling mattered to him. More than the outcome. At least for a while. Hector staying, not because it was easy, but because it was expected. Because leaving would mean letting everything else fall apart. Even the Trojan Horse, that final moment. It's easy to think of it as clever strategy, but there's something else there too. Fatigue. A kind of quiet willingness to believe that things are over, even if part of you suspects they might not be. Because after a long enough struggle, you start wanting an ending so badly that you stop questioning it. And that's not weakness. It's just being tired. So maybe the truth behind the Trojan War isn't one big lesson. It's a collection of smaller ones, soft ones, the kind that don't shout. Like how pride can stretch things out longer than they need to be. Not in a dramatic, villainous way, just in that quiet, stubborn way where no one wants to be the first to let go. Or how promises, even well-intentioned ones, can become heavy over time, especially when the situation changes, but the promise doesn't. Or how sometimes people don't make wrong decisions. They just make decisions without knowing how far they'll reach. And by the time they realize, they're already in the middle of something. And stepping back feels harder than continuing forward. It's not heroic. It's not tragic. It's just human. So now, as everything settles for real, there's nothing left to follow. No more characters to check in on. No more slow-moving consequences drifting into view. Just this quiet space. After the story, where things don't need to be resolved. They just are. And maybe that's the most restful part. No expectations. no outcomes.
Just stillness.
So let your mind wander a bit. Or don't. Let the thoughts come and go. Or fade completely. The Trojan War, with all its noise and chaos, is now just a soft echo. And you don't have to carry any of it. Just rest. Hey, if you're somehow still here, this is it. No more hidden layers. No secret extra ending. No, actually, one more thing moment. Just the quiet end of a very long, very human story. At this point, you don't need the details anymore. The names have softened. The events have blurred. Paris, Achilles, Hector, Helen, they're less like specific people now, and more like impressions. Little emotional shapes your mind can recognize without effort. And that's kind of the final shift. The story stops being something you follow and becomes something you feel. A sense of something that started small, grew slowly, lasted longer than it probably should have, and then ended in a way that wasn't quite satisfying, but felt inevitable. Like a conversation that went on too long, or a decision that carried more weight than expected, or just one of those things in life that didn't wrap up neatly but eventually stopped. Because not everything gets a perfect ending. Most things just fade. And the Trojan War, for all its scale, all its drama, all its legendary status, does the same thing. It fades. The ships leave. The city quiets. The people, the few that remain, go on. Different lives. Different stories. And somewhere much later, someone tells a story again. A little differently. A little softer. A little shaped by their own world. And now you've heard it too. Not as a loud, heroic tale, but as something slower, calmer, a little more human. So there's nothing left to figure out, nothing left to analyze. You don't need to remember every part. Just keep the feeling, that gentle understanding that even the biggest stories, even the ones filled with gods and kings and impossible choices, are still made out of the same quiet pieces. A decision, a reaction, a moment that seemed small until it wasn't. And then time, lots of time. So now, let it all go. Let the story drift away completely. No need to hold on to it. Just rest and let the quiet take over.